Houston. Houston, we have a problem. DJ Apollo has landed. I repeat, DJ Apollo has landed.
Hear me?
You are listening to the Tales of Music and Film podcast. My name is Christian Taylor, and thank you for clicking on today's episode. Now for this one, we are going to have ourselves some more fun, ladies and gentlemen, because today we're going to be doing something a little different. So, as many of you are very aware, if you've been listening to the show for a while now, is that I'm a big ship historian. I love studying ship history, and there's one ship in mind, I'm sure all of you will know, that I am a huge fan of, the ship that I've studied more than anything else, the RMS Titanic. Possibly, and I think this is true, it is the most famous shipwreck in the entire world, and it gets attention all the time. And the story has been told a million times over, and I have been studying Titanic since I was in second grade, ever since I saw that National Geographic book that was released in 1986, a year after Dr. Robert Ballard and his team found the RMS Titanic on the seafloor. The book had a cover of the first half of the ship, the bow, sitting in the bottom of the seafloor, and the minute I saw that photograph, my life changed forever. I've read dozens of books from my town's library. Growing up, I watched countless documentaries about it, from National Geographic to Discovery Channel. And I've seen the Titanic film by James Cameron a couple of times, and it's a very good movie. And that is going to bring us to our discussion today, is Titanic 1997. Just how historically accurate is this movie? Now, I know that many of you are going to be bringing up, well, wait a minute, Christian, you've already covered the 1997 film like a year ago, and that is correct, but I've been having this thought in the back of my mind that it would be very cool to come back to Titanic 1997 and compare it to the real history and just see, let's do some comparing here, just how historically accurate did Cameron and his team get this film? Like, how close to the real thing did they get? How historically accurate did they get this film? And I've been asking myself that question, and I have a list of notes here that we'll go through, and I think this is going to make for a very fun episode, so let's get into it. Let's dive back into the blockbuster hit that is James Cameron's 1997 Titanic film, and even today it's still one of the biggest movies ever made. I remember seeing a chart recently. I believe Titanic 1997 is now in fourth place for the top 10 highest grossing films of all time. And this movie won 11 Academy Awards, and it made over $1 billion at the box office. So yeah, it's a very successful film. And I'm very excited to be getting into here just how historically accurate this film is. So now, the first section of notes that I will discuss with all you guys is small errors, is what I call it. So now, the first one is, these first things that I will discuss here are just maybe small little things, just small little errors that were featured in the film. So the first one is that we all know the sequence of when old Rose is brought on board the expedition ship to begin telling her story about her experience on the RMS Titanic. And when she begins telling her story, we get this beautiful transition of the wreck of Titanic sitting on the seafloor, and it transitions to Titanic sitting at the Southampton dock, all brand new and ready to set sail. And we see that the platform is swarmed with people and onlookers waiting to see the ship set sail. And we see these early 20th century, cars show up, and we see 17-year-old Rose and her mom and Rose's fiance Cal getting out of them. And during this whole sequence, the entire Southampton, area is just bathed in sunlight. It's a clear, sunny day, blue sky. It's a very beautiful day. And it's a beautifully made scene that really just shows you how beautiful Titanic is, and just setting the scene for how exciting this moment in time was for all these people, getting to see another brand new White Star Line vessel getting ready to set sail, because the year prior, the first ship in the Olympic class. So a little side note for you. So Titanic and her siblings, Olympic and Britannic, all three of these ships were the Olympic class vessels for the White Star Line shipping company, and these ships were built by the Harland and Wolff company. So Harland and Wolff and White Star Line have been working together for like over half a century, building hundreds of ships. And the Harland and Wolff shipyard is located in Belfast, Ireland. And the Olympic was the first one out of the three ships to be built and set sail. The Olympic had her maiden voyage back in 1911, and that was a big moment. So now, the following year, Titanic's getting ready to set sail, and it's a big day. But there's one small little error with the entire Southampton sequence. So going back to what I was saying about, the dock being bathed in sunlight, if you can actually look up photographs from the day that Titanic was getting ready to leave the Southampton dock, and when you look at these photographs, it paints a really different picture. In real life, the Southampton dock was really gray and overcast. Like, it was very, really like Britain weather, it was really cloudy. There were gray clouds everywhere. There wasn't really a whole lot of sunlight. It was very overcast. Now, I've actually seen people say that Old Rose is like looking at this event, with rose-tinted glasses because of her old age. Maybe she's like glamorizing this more than it really was, and that could be a possibility. But nonetheless, it doesn't really change much. Just in real life, it was not a bright sunny day at the Southampton dock. Now, number 2 on the small errors list is that, so we all know the scene of Jack is in a bar, I believe, and Titanic's very minutes away from leaving the dock, and Jack wins a card game, and him and his friend Fabrizio both get RMS Titanic tickets, and they had to run out of the bar, grab their stuff, and run down to the dock, and they just barely made it. The planks were being taken away by the time they reached the dock. And Jack lies to an officer saying that him and his friend went through the inspection queue. They just outright skipped the inspection queue. And then Jack and Fabrizio are just let on board at the last possible second. Now, in real life, Jack and Fabrizio would have been denied access to Titanic because you were not allowed to skip, the inspection queue, because back in the early 20th century, sickness at sea was a very dangerous thing. Like, now that we all know in our post-COVID-19 world is that, sickness can spread like mad. And I'm talking, very, very fast. And you gotta keep in mind, this is 1912. Vaccines weren't even a thing yet, So sickness at sea was a very, very dangerous thing. So they took inspection very seriously. There's a small little moment where you can see this man at the Southampton dock with a long beard, and a Titanic officer is checking his beard for lice. It's just little things like that. That was things they really did because they took this stuff very seriously at this time. And they still do today, from what I know. So Jack and Fabrizio would not have been allowed to skip the inspection queue because sickness at sea was very dangerous at this time. And just to give an example, the Olympic was transitioned into a troop carrier vessel during World War I, and the ship did survive the First World War, but after World War I, the RMS Olympic actually had to be docked in New York for about over a week because an illness had broke out on board, and none of the passengers were allowed to leave until it was taken care of. So again, just showing you more evidence, especially back in this time, Sickness at sea was taken very seriously, and every precaution was taken to prevent it from spreading or prevent it from happening, at all. So, in real life, Jackie Fabrizio would not have been allowed to skip the inspection queue. That would not have been allowed to happen. And another, as we continue down the list, another point that I'd like to bring up, this is a small little thing, is the lighting of the ship. So, for many of you who don't know, I am a substitute teacher, and last year's school season, I worked from about November all the way through the rest of the year. And towards the end of my first year being a sub-teacher, I learned that the school building that I was working at, Lincoln School housed 3rd to 5th grade. And I learned that most of the classes in the building were learning about Titanic. And when I learned about this, the school board gave me permission to make a very detailed Titanic slideshow for children. And I made it, and I ended up presenting it to a couple of 5th grade classes. Then I ended up giving it to almost every 3rd and 4th grade class. And the best part for me was definitely the 3rd graders. Like, they loved my Titanic slideshow. And when I made this, I made sure to add a slide. Like, someone made this really cool comparison photograph where the top shows how lit Titanic was in the Cameron film. And at the very bottom, he edited the photo to make the lighting look like how it would have in real life. And the ship is almost pitch black. And that really opened up my mind to the fact, like, in real life, Titanic was not lit up that well. Because if you watched the 1997 Cameron film, the ship is a giant beam of light. Like, the lights are shining very brightly. You can see, like, the entire thing. And if it was lit up like that in real life, like, how could they have possibly missed the iceberg? If the ship was that well lit. Well, you gotta remember that this is a Hollywood production. They want you to see everything. Just like when the ship is sinking, the ship is extremely lit up throughout the entire sinking process. In real life, Titanic's lights were not that bright. It was pitch dark, man. Like, during the entire sinking process, like, this is something that people don't realize, that when you look at, pictures of the ship in books, or if you watch the Cameron film, like, the ship is extremely lit up because they want the viewers to see every little detail on the ship. But in real life, man, Titanic sunk in total darkness. Like, when you went up on deck, you could barely see anything on what's going on. So you're on a sinking ship. It's pitch black. People are starting to go in full panic mode. Like, it was terrifying, man. It was bad. Like the ship was not lit up like as that. It was not that lit up like how it is in the film. But again, just a small thing. Like I said, you gotta remember it's a Hollywood production. They want you to see everything. Like, heck, even another little detail is that during Titanic's sinking, during the end, when the stern was super high up in the air, when the lights go out, you can still see the entire ship because there's like this moonlight beaming on the ship. And we all know in real life there was no moon during the night the ship sank. Like, the only light source you had was the night sky. So when Titanic's lights went out, like, it was pitch black. You couldn't even see, like, your hand in front of your face. Like, there was no light source whatsoever. And, they had this blue tint on the screen trying to convey to the audience that it is an extremely cold night, and the water was extremely cold. Like, most of the people who perished that night, they froze to death in the water after the ship was lost. So yeah, in real life, Titanic's lights were nowhere near as bright as they were shown in the movie. Now, another small detail here is, now this is one that they deliberately cut from the movie and just did not do, and I understand full-heartedly why they decided to cut this. So, Titanic did not sink on an even keel, and what that term means is that in the 1997 film, Titanic sinks by the head, right? Like the ship, the front is going down first, like it's being submerged below the water. Like the front's going down, slowly dropping like a stone, and meanwhile the back, the stern, is slowly raising higher and higher out of the water. It's kind of like Titanic was basically a giant 882 feet long lever in a way, where the front's going down and the back is going up, and the middle of the ship is kind of like the fulcrum of balancing out the weight. It's a nice little comparison for it, which is what led to the ship's structure failing towards the end, and I'll get more into that as we progress through the notes. But going back to how Titanic sank, the 1997 film shows the ship sinking on a very even keel, but in real life, the ship did not sink that even, and there's a couple of key reasons for that. So the first one is something that I don't think a lot of people know, not necessarily, unless you've researched a lot, is that there was a coal bunker fire in coal bunker number 5, and this fire actually started a few days before Titanic left Southampton, and it was still, and even the first few days out at sea. So Titanic was out at sea for a total of 4 days before the iceberg collision. And on day 2 of being out at sea, the fire was finally distinguished, I think is the term, and they had to do this by fully emptying out, that compartment of, they had to empty out that entire bunker of coal and move it to a different one. It was, the reason the fire started, it was a spontaneous combustion of the coal. Like, water gets on it, and I believe if some sparks are thrown on there, it could start a coal fire. So they had to empty out the entire bunker in order to put it out completely. And when they moved all the coal out of that bunker, they moved it into a different one on the right-hand side of the ship. So when they did this, the weight of the vessel wasn't as even. So even before the iceberg collision, Titanic may have been leaning a little slightly towards the right, even before the iceberg collision. And then, when the iceberg collision happened, the ship sideswiped the iceberg, because when the iceberg was spotted, it was right in Titanic's path, and First Officer Murdoch ordered the ship, hard to starboard, which I believe in ship term means, have the ship start turning left. And when they did this, and now this whole series of events of trying to miss the iceberg was about 30 to 40 seconds. That's all they had. So during that 30-second time gap, the ship started to turn towards the left, and they almost got out of the way, but the right-hand side of the hull, scraped alongside the iceberg, and when this happened, the rivets that were holding the steel and iron together, the tops of the rivets were popped off, and when the iceberg scraped along the hull, it made 6 injuries, if you will, along the hull, making openings, and the iceberg ended up opening 6 watertight compartments. Now, Titanic was designed with 16 watertight compartments, where if the first 4 compartments were full all the way with water, the ship could remain afloat. That was the big state-of-the-art safety feature that was built on the ship. And that was where people started getting the idea that nothing could sink this ship. Like in the words of Rose's fiance, Cal, he directly says at the Southampton dock that God himself could not sink this ship. And apparently, just a little side note, apparently that quote of Titanic is unsinkable, it was actually used, I think, in a newspaper article or something. Like, the White Star Line never released, like, I don't think they ever released, like, an actual statement saying, oh, by the way, this ship's unsinkable. I don't think the company ever actually did release that statement. I think that's kind of like a small little inconception about Titanic. There weren't, like, any, like, promotional posters saying, oh, please board the unsinkable Titanic. You know, that was just something that was said once, people liked it, so obviously the quote got more famous. And it gave all the passengers the sense that the ship could not sink. Like, no matter how much damage, nothing could sink this vessel. But anyway, going back to the even keel here. So, when the iceberg scraped along Titanic's hull, when it made the 6 damaged areas, 20 minutes after the collision. So if you read the book, which I highly recommend you guys read this, it's a book titled On a Sea of Glass, and this is, in my opinion, the greatest Titanic book that's ever been written. And in the book, there are several, like a dozen eyewitness accounts saying that when passengers started going up on deck after the iceberg collision, like even I didn't know this, is that right after the iceberg collision, 20 minutes after, so the Titanic struck the iceberg at around 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, so about 20 minutes later, so we're at midnight at this point. Titanic was already showing symptoms that something was wrong, because many eyewitnesses said when they went up on deck, they noticed that the ship was already starting to lean towards the right-hand side a lot more than usual, and this is called a list. A list means is that the ship is leaning towards a certain direction. And the ship's leaning got worse as the sinking progressed, but throughout the sinking, as the water filled up more of the rooms in the lower levels, the ship did eventually start evening itself out. Like, I'm pretty sure during the sinking it was leaning towards the right. Then it started getting more even. Then it may have even started leaning towards the left a little bit. But towards the end of the sinking, when the final plunge was starting, the ship basically did even itself out. But during the sinking, you know, it was not on this very even keel the entire time. But going back to what I was saying earlier, I fully understand why Cameron decided not to add this in the film, because you got to remember, so they had basically built about a 90% model of the real thing and was dropping it in water with like cranes and stuff. Like, they were literally sinking pretty much a 90% full scale model of the real thing. And if they had attempted to add this list in the film, it would have added millions to the budget, and it would have taken a long time to film the sinking sequences. Like, the sinking sequences in the film were extremely hard to film all on their own. Now imagine, like, they had to, like, you know, every shot they had to keep angling the decks, right? Leaning towards the right. Okay, we gotta reshoot this again. Okay, now flip it over this way. Like, it would have been extremely complicated. It would have taken forever, you know, to do that. So I fully understand why they decided not to add in the film. I mean, it's a small little thing. It doesn't really change a whole lot, but just a small little thing that they decided not to add. And while we're on that subject, this is another moment that Cameron just outright did not add in the film. But again, I understand why he probably decided not to add this, because it's nothing really like that important. But for any of you who don't know, is that Titanic did almost have disaster, and we're just talking like minutes after leaving the Southampton dock. So while the ship was being pulled out, you know, from the dock with everybody on board, you had these tugboats, right? I think there may have been like 3 of them that were helping pull Titanic out to the open ocean. And Titanic ended up driving past this dock that had 2 vessels tied to it that were the New York and the Oceanic. And the reason why those ships were there is because, so before Titanic left the Southampton dock, there was actually a coal strike going on where workers felt like they were being underappreciated, and they were fighting to get their minimum wages brought up. And because of this, they just outright quit working and getting coal to ships where they were needed. So because of this, dozens of ships were sitting around, docks everywhere, and especially in Southampton with nowhere to go, because back in the early 20th century, ships were powered with coal. And there was a coal shortage now. So Titanic had to borrow leftover coal from other vessels in order to make her maiden voyage. So because of this, the Southampton dock was covered, there were ships everywhere. So the Oceanic and the New York were sitting tied to a dock, and when Titanic passed those two ships, these loud, noises started going off, like it was like gunfire or like a cannon going off. And those sounds were these thick ropes that were as thick as tree trunks, by the way, were snapping. And these were the ropes that were holding the Oceanic and the New York to the dock. They were snapping because Titanic, due to how, so you gotta remember, right? Titanic was the biggest ship afloat at this point. This ship is 4 city blocks long, and the ship has the width of a 4-lane highway. And I don't think that people were taking into account just the sheer scale of the ship. What happened was that the ship was creating this force in the water, and this force was pulling the Oceanic and the New York away from the dock towards Titanic. And these two vessels were just meters away from colliding into the Titanic. And this could have ended, the main voyage could have been ended right then and there, but thankfully Captain Smith, who was the captain of the Titanic, ordered the ship to turn a certain way, and a tugboat heroically came in and helped pull the Oceanic and the New York away from Titanic, and the main voyage was allowed to go back underway. So I can understand. Titanic almost had disaster even before leaving Southampton, and I can understand that Cameron and his team probably decided not to add this in the film. I'm pretty sure it was well documented by the 90s at this point, but I can understand why they decided to cut it, because I feel like it would have, really would have killed the pacing big time if they had added that entire sequence into the film. So I can understand for pacing's sake that it wasn't added. But again, it was nothing like that serious. The entire sequence in the film of Titanic leaving the Southampton dock was beautifully done. It just shows you how beautiful Titanic was, just how big of a day it was getting to see the ship leave Southampton. And while we're talking about that, there's this one small little error in the Southampton sequence in the film, is that you can clearly see a man wearing this newsboy cap, and he has a camera set up on the Southampton dock, and he's filming Titanic leaving the dock. Now, in real life, nobody filmed Titanic leaving the Southampton dock. There is sadly no existing footage, to my knowledge, of the ship leaving Southampton. And I think, and from what I've watched, the big reason why there's no existing footage is that none of the news companies at the time they weren't really that interested in Titanic. Because you got to remember, literally the previous year, the Olympic had set sail on her maiden voyage. And Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic, they were basically triplets. If you sat the three of them right next to each other, they were about the same length, same height, same, structure for the most part. They were pretty much identical. And this was true to Titanic and Olympic. If you put them right next to each other, you could have played a game of, mix-up. Can you tell me which one's the Olympic and which one's Titanic? Because they looked extremely identical. We're talking, small little key differences to how you could differentiate the two ships. And when the Olympic went out on her main voyage, like, the entire thing was covered up and down. Like, the press covered Olympic out as much as they possibly could. Like, tons of photographs were taken of the ship being built, when the ship was finished, and pictures of, like, the rooms, the grand staircase. Like the Olympic was extremely well documented. But this was not true with Titanic, because, like I said, Titanic was basically a clone of the Olympic, basically. So news companies weren't that interested in this. Like, Titanic had, like, this middle child, like, syndrome going on, where, it's not getting nowhere near enough attention as the first ship did. So it's like, when you look at photographs of interior in any Titanic book, 9 out of 10, the pictures that you're seeing are rooms from the Olympic. Like, for example, there's no existing photographs of Titanic's grand staircase. If you look at any picture books of Titanic, the grand staircase photo that you will see in these books is actually the Olympics. So, yeah, Olympic was documented as much as they could, and it was very famous. But Titanic did not get nowhere near as much coverage as the Olympic did. And no news companies had bothered to film the ship leaving, which they ended up regretting, heavily. But after the Titanic disaster, news companies did a very dubious thing. I actually learned about this earlier this year, is that you can find, quote, footage of Titanic leaving Southampton, which that footage does not exist. What news companies did, right? Now, this is interesting. So we're going to be diving into something. So in the early 20th century, right, Photoshop was actually a thing, and it's a little complicated. So a certain news company used footage of the Olympic leaving New York. And what they did was, they tried to pass this footage off as Titanic leaving Southampton, and people bought it. When you look at this footage, though, if you look further down towards the bottom of the footage, you can see the tugboats that are helping pull the Olympic out of the New York dock. And you can see behind them, there's like this little white mist going on, right? An editor has went through every piece of the film and scratched out the very backs of the tugboats, because on the back of the tugboats it says New York. So some man scratched out New York out of the back of the tugboats to make it look like that it was Titanic leaving the Southampton dock, but in reality it's the Olympic leaving New York City. And this footage has been used, I'm pretty sure, in countless documentaries. So that's a little, like, very early 20th century Photoshop. Now, the last, like, small little detail that I want to talk about here is, now, we all know the famous scene of Jack and Rose going to the very front of the ship, like the very front of the bow, and then, the famous scene of, Rose saying, "Jack, I'm flying." Like, it's a very popular scene, and it has its rightful place in pop culture history. Like, there was this comedy film that just came out recently called Anyone But You, where there's a scene where this young couple even pays tribute to that sequence. So even today, over 25 years later, that scene is still very much in people's minds. Now, the big question is, would Jack and Rose had been allowed to go up to the very front of the bow in real life? Like, heck, Jack and his friend Fabrizio go to that exact same spot earlier in the film, like during when Titanic enters the open ocean after leaving Cherbourg in France to pick up additional passengers. So again, would Jack and Fabrizio and Jack and Rose have been allowed to go up to that spot? Now, growing up as a kid, my mindset was always that, oh, heck no, there ain't no way that Jack and Rose or Fabrizio would ever have been allowed to go up to that spot. It's very dangerous. What if they'd fallen over the railing and into the water, you know? Like, that was the mindset that I had. But apparently, there was a lot of gray area with this spot. So in real life, okay, if you look up photos of, like, Olympics decking, you can see passengers, or there's a photograph that I saw once, I believe it's on the Olympic, where there's a giant group of passengers at the very front of the ship, towards the area where Jack and Rose were. And if you look behind them, you can clearly see a sign that reads, "No people past this point." But it seems like the crew weren't exactly enforcing that rule. So, with this in mind, it seems that in most cases, ships weren't really, I guess, forceful of that rule of going to the very front of the ship. At least not in the White Star Line's case. So, with this in mind, it does seem very plausible that Jack and Rose would have been allowed to go to the very front of the ship. So, it seems that this rule wasn't exactly, being forced at the time. So, it's plausible that in real life a couple could have went to the very front and done that pose. So yeah, this is one last little small detail for you. So now we're going to be getting into the section that I'm very excited about, what the film got correct. So let's go through the list here. So the first thing the film gets correct is the engine room scene. So we all know the famous scene that I was talking about earlier, where Titanic sets sail to the open ocean for the first time. Because after Titanic left Southampton, the ship made 2 additional stops in Queenstown and Cherbourg in France to pick up more passengers. So after Titanic made the final stop in Cherbourg, Titanic left that dock and headed out to the open ocean for the 4 days out at sea. And we get this beautiful scene of Captain Smith telling Officer Murdoch, "Take her to sea, Mr. Murdoch. Let's stretch her legs." And then we see Murdoch telling one of the other officers, full steam, all the way full. And you can see an officer walking over to operate the telegraph machine to signal down to the engine room to have the ship go at full speed. And we see Chief Engineer Joseph Bell get the call, and he tells his workers, all the way full ahead full is the term. So the engines are sped up to go to full speed, and we get the shot of the coal workers dumping more coal into the boiler, no, not the boilers, into the coal fires to make steam which powers the ship. And the engine turbine starts spinning faster and faster, and that's a real engine room. This engine room scenes were filmed in a real-life ship that was pronounced, the ship's name was the SS Germain O'Brien Liberty ship, and it was and the engine room scenes were filmed in that ship, and it was in San Francisco. Now, it used similar engines to Titanic, but the problem was the engines weren't big enough. So what Cameron and his team did, they digitally made the humans smaller to make the engines look bigger. And Hollywood films do this kind of thing all the time. Like, I just learned recently, so when we see the scene in the original Alien film from 1979, when we see Dallas and the other 2 crew members boarding the alien vessel, that is director Ridley Scott's children dressed up in spacesuits to scale the ship up. So he had children actors dressed up in the costumes to make the ship look bigger than what it really was. And yeah, so like I said, films have been doing that for a very, very long time. So I think it was really cool that they filmed these engine sequences in a real-life engine room. And another thing that the film gets right are the events leading up to the iceberg collision. So, we see the scene of Frederick Fleet and Regional Lee, who were the lookouts in the crow's nest. They were the ones who spotted the berg, and they actually didn't see the berg. With how dark it was, all they could see was the black outline of an object right in the ship's path, getting closer, and that's when they knew that it was an iceberg. So the film portrays, them of Frederick Fleet. Frederick Fleet, I believe, is the one who picked up the phone, and he's like waiting for someone to answer. An officer answers the phone on the bridge saying, "What do you see?" And he says, "Iceberg right ahead." And about this time, First Officer Murdoch, who was in charge of the bridge at the time, he also noticed it, and he quickly hurries to signal the engine room to have the engine stop and then reverse the engines to have the ship go full of starboard. So he orders the quartermaster, who's at the driver's wheel, to start turning the wheel to the left side, because Murdoch's trying to get the ship to start turning left as quickly as possible, because again, like I mentioned earlier, Titanic had a reaction time of about 30 to 40-ish seconds. So the quartermaster is working to turn the wheel all the way to the left-hand side, and Murdoch's signaling the engine rooms to have the engines go full of stop, and then have the ship start turning, left. They're trying to reduce speed and get the ship to start going towards the left. And this whole sequence was done brilliantly. Like, it really set the stakes of, oh my gosh, are they going to be able to get the ship out of the way in time? And, as a viewer, you're thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to make it, but they almost made it, but the ship scraped alongside the berg, and the rest is history. And another small little detail, I was actually really happy that Cameron added this, but I feel like he should have added more scenes. So for any of you who don't know, a good amount of Titanic's workers who worked in like the coal bunkers, the electricity room, most of them perished in the sinking. And a reason for this is because most of them stayed behind at their post and kept, coal workers stayed down in the coal bunkers and kept shoveling coal into the fires to power the turbines, because Titanic's lights were on throughout the entire sinking process. The lights didn't go out up until the ship broke in half. The lights shone brightly throughout the sinking, but the lights started to dim, throughout the sinking process because they weren't getting enough power, so the lights started to go red towards the end of the sinking, which that was another thing that was not featured in the movie, but it's not a big deal. But we get this one small scene in the film where we see workers in the electricity room trying to keep the lights on, and one poor guy gets electrocuted, and then the lights go out for good. Now, in real life, those workers had already left their post by that point. By the time the final plunge was starting, all the workers had used the emergency ladders to leave the rooms and go up on deck. In real life, they wouldn't have been down there during the sequence, but it doesn't take away from the fact that these gentlemen stayed at their posts throughout the entire sinking and worked like mad to keep the lights on. And that is, the ultimate form of bravery. And another thing the film does theoretically get right is the angle in which the stern reached. So, towards the end of the Cameron film, we see the back of the ship, which is the stern, reaching an angle of about 45 degrees, because by that time, it was believed that the stern reached like a 45-degree angle. But with our new updated history and tests, we now know that would have been impossible. There's no way the stern could have in real life reached that height. So this may have been a information gap thing, but in real life, so about a decade after the Cameron film was released, tests were done on steel that was recovered from the Titanic wreck site, and tests were conducted on them, and they found that the steel started failing when the stern reached a height of somewhere between 25 to 32 degrees. And that's a big difference compared to 45. But in reality, if you're like a passenger in a boat, right, looking ahead, watching the ship sink like that, or if you're in the water looking up, the stern would have looked like it was at 45 degrees. Because, I mean, like, you got this giant structure that was as tall as the, like, if Titanic sat from the bottom up, the ship was actually taller than the Empire State Building in New York City. That's just to give you another idea of just the sheer scale of this ship. When the stern was high up in the air like that, it would have looked like it was 45 degrees. But in real life, the ship never did reach like that height. But still, I think it was really cool that Cameron decided to have it reach 45 degrees in the film, because from a passenger standpoint, that's what it would have looked like, to you. And the detail of the lights going out right before the ship broke in half is actually theoretically correct. Now, there is no way for us to know for sure, but from all the eyewitness accounts, the same story was that the lights went out just a few minutes before the breakup happened. And it was accurately portrayed in the film where the ship just goes pitch black. And it's a very creepy, moment. And I think the film brilliantly did a good job of doing that sequence. And now this next little section here is that, so Titanic has over 40 minutes of material that was cut from the film. And you can find all these deleted scenes on YouTube. But all these scenes are all historically accurate scenes that I think all these should have been kept in. And I really do hope that one day we get a director's cut. I doubt it'll ever happen, but I wish Cameron would release a director's cut, because I think all these scenes are all amazing and they deserve to be in the film because, again, they're all historically accurate. They should be included. Now, the first deleted scene, there's two of them actually, is both these deleted scenes harp around Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, which were Titanic's telegraph operators. So Titanic had this state-of-the-art, brand new Marconi machine that sent out telegrams through Morse code. The Marconi device was first introduced in 1909, and it was a state-of-the-art invention. For the first time in human history, ships could communicate with one another about their positions and where they were, because, sonar, radar wouldn't be invented for another, 40 or 50 years later. So the Marconi device was all you had to send out your coordinates on where you were, or to send out distress calls. It was a major breakthrough in technology for the early 20th century. And every ship by this point had Marconi machine operators. And in Titanic's case, it was Jack Phillips, who was 25, and Harold Bride, who was only 22, and they were the operators. And one of the deleted scenes, we see just a few hours before the iceberg collision, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were busy at work sending out, telegrams, because a small little detail, again, that's not featured in the film, is that when Titanic was a few days out at sea, when Jack Phillips and Harold Bride realized the Marconi device was broken. And the law was, back then, that the operators were not allowed to repair the Marconi device if it was found to be broken. You had to wait till the ship docked at its next destination and wait for a licensed repairman to come on board and fix the device himself. But Jack Phillips and Harold Bride decided to break the law and fix the device themselves. And Jack Phillips fixed the device during his off hours when he should have been sleeping. And the machine was back up and running again just a few hours before the iceberg collision. And by this point, the passenger mail on telegrams to be sent had piled dramatically. So Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were hard at work trying to send out as many messages as they can. And remember, by this point, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride are probably extremely, maybe slightly frustrated and tired with getting the device working again and trying to send out all these messages. And by this time, Jack Phillips was the one operating the machine, and he was trying to contact a station called Cape Race that was very far away from Titanic's position, so Jack had to have his volume for his headset cranked up all the way so he could hear the faint signal from the Cape Race station. So a ship that was nearby Titanic called the Californian set a iceberg warning out to the ship. And when this happened, very loud static noises went through Jack's headset, and it kind of annoyed him. So he sent back a reply to the Californian saying, "Stay out, shut up, I'm working, Cape Race." And then we see the scene of the wireless operator on the Californian acting angry, like, "I can't believe he talked to me like that. I just warned him about ice, and he tells me to shut up." And apparently in real life, this is how operators talk to one another. But this entire scene of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride getting the Californian ice warning, and then Jack Phillips telling the Californian to shut up, it's accurately portrayed. Like, it's historically accurate from what we know, because Jack Phillips was lost in the sinking, Harold Bride survived. So we know that this scene is factually true, from mostly. And I can't believe it. That whole scene was brilliantly shot. And I couldn't believe that they decided to cut this from the movie. And another small little scene was right after the meeting of all the officers getting together with Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews discussing the damage of the ship and realizing that the ship was going to sink. The captain wasted no time and going straight to the wireless room and telling Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to start sending out SOS calls. And then they start doing it. It's a small little scene that shows a lot about their character that I wish that had been kept in the film. Now, lastly, another point that I want to talk about here is another point. This is another deleted scene, is the rescue of a Chinese man. So, after Titanic had fully submerged around 2 a.m., so the ship fully disappeared from view around 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, and out of the 20, Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats. All 20 of them were launched, but out of the 20 boats, only 2 boats went back to look for survivors after the ship sank. And one of the passengers that was rescued was this Chinese man who was leaning down on a piece of wood, balancing himself out. And one of the boats found him and picked him up. And the scene was very accurately portrayed in the film. It's another deleted scene I wish they kept in, because by all accounts, it was historically accurate. And another small deleted scene is the gymnasium sequence. So we have this small little sequence of Thomas Andrews giving Rose and her fiance and Rose's mom a tour of the ship. And there's a deleted sequence of them getting a tour of Titanic's gymnasium. And we see this device that you can use that teaches you how to row a boat. And this is historically accurate too, because in real life, the guy in charge of the gymnasium was offering passengers the chance to get experience or practice on how to row a lifeboat. And they were like, I don't think I'm going to need to know how to do that. This ship's unsinkable, which is what, Rose's mom says to an extent. So that's a historically accurate reaction to how the passengers felt in real life. So again, it was another scene I think they should have kept in. And there's this small little 20-second deleted scene with Molly Brown that I wish they kept in. So during the iceberg sequence, there's a deleted scene where Molly Brown is in one of the first class dining rooms, and she asks for some more ice for her drink. Meanwhile, you see the giant iceberg go by the window. And I feel like that was a little nod to something, because apparently after the iceberg collision, people were going up on deck and they were finding a ton of ice that broke off from the berg and it fell on deck. And some of the men who were still up by this point were in the first class smoking room playing cards. And one guy told them, like, hey, there's a bunch of broken ice on deck. And one guy was like, chap, could you grab some of that ice for me? I could use some for my beverage. you know? And there was another eyewitness account that you can read about in the book On a Sea of Glass, where this one guy grabbed some of the ice and jokingly put it in one of his friend's drinks. Like, here's some fresh iceberg ice for you, pal. you know, so I thought that was pretty cool that... I thought it was kind of funny, but I feel like that small little sequence of Molly Brown should have been kept in, because it actually shows you that many passengers were still awake by this point, and just seeing that giant white object go by the window was actually kind of scary, man. And I was surprised they cut that. And going back to playing with ice, there's another deleted scene where we see Jack and Rose on deck, and we see passengers in the background playing with the ice that broke off. Again, another accurate betraying the Titanic history. And one last moment, deleted scene that I wish they kept in was when Molly Brown boards her lifeboat and it hits the water. She notices that many of the crew members that are in charge of that boat, they don't know how to row the boat correctly, and Molly does. So she teaches them how to row the boat correctly, and then she basically takes charge of that lifeboat. And that's what earned her the nickname the Unsinkable Molly Brown, as she's still known today in history. And that was another, another small moment I wish they kept in the film. So yeah, like I said, there's a long list of, deleted scenes that are historically accurate that I was very surprised they cut from the film. And one last small little thing that I like is that, so we all know the famous scene of when Jack and Rose meet each other for the first time. Rose runs to the very back of the stern and climbs over the railing, and she is debating whether or not she's going to jump in the water. Because by this point, we realize that she's living a life that she does not want. She's 17 years old, and she's living this rich family life, and the only thing that Rose's mom cares about is status and fame. And you find out that Rose's fiance is a very abusive man, and Rose wants nothing to do with him. She doesn't even like him, but she's basically being forced, by her mother to marry him because he's a millionaire. And in the words of Rose herself, she feels trapped, not being able to live a life that she wants to live. And by this point, it had taken a toll on her. So she was thinking about just killing herself at this point. And that was when Jack shows up and convinces her to come back from the railing, And while she's hanging from the railing, he takes his shoes off. He's telling her, if you jump, I'm going to jump in there after you. I'm not going to like it, though. And she's like, why? Because, this water is freezing cold. And he talks about, he grew up in Alaska, I believe he said. It's been a while since I've seen the film, but he talks about where a friend of his once told him that when you jump from a high altitude into freezing cold water, Jack says it's like 1,000 knives penetrating your skin all at the same time. And that is a actual direct quote that was taken from one of the Titanic survivors. His name, funny enough, was Jack Thayer. He was a first-class 17-year-old kid who survived the sinking. He was on a voyage. Him and his parents were first-class passengers on Titanic, and Jack survived the sinking. Towards the end, when the stern was super high up in the air, Jack Thayer is one of the few people who jumped from the stern and hit the water and survived. Because most passengers, when they were jumping from that height, they were dying instantly they hit the water from making contact. Because the way the life preservers were designed, it would go around there would be two straps. One strap would go around your neck, the second one would go around your waist. And when people were jumping from that height, their necks were being snapped the minute they hit the water, because these life preservers were designed to stop you from going under. So when you hit the water, you wouldn't go under and come back up. Like, you would just stop. So many passengers who jumped from the stern to the water were having their necks snapped. But Jack was one of the few people who jumped from the stern into the water and survived. And when he was being questioned at one of the inquiries, trying to figure out what caused the sinking, his exact quote was, "When he jumped in the water, I felt like a bunch of knives were cutting me at the same time." So that is a very accurate, quote that was taken straight from Jack, and for, Jack to say in the movie. So I thought that was a nice little detail that made its way into the movie. Now, the last section that we are going to discuss here is that, so, the James Cameron 1997 film, I love the film to death. I think it's a fantastic film, but it has a bad reputation on one thing that bothers me to this very day, is that Titanic is guilty of portraying real-life people in a very negative way, and just not accurately portraying these people and making them, like, not doing them justice, and making them either look bad or, or, like, making them villains or making them responsible for stuff they didn't actually do in real life. And I'll give you examples. So I have 6 people total here that I'll give a quick little discussion about. So the first one is, so the first person that I want to talk about here is how the movie depicts Captain Smith. So in the film, Captain Smith, I thought, was pretty accurately portrayed up until the sinking starts. So throughout the entire sinking process, Captain Smith is shown to be in this huge state of shock of not knowing what to do. And he's very nervous, and he doesn't know, like, what to do. In real life, that is not at all how Captain Smith was. He worked his butt off throughout the entire sinking, commanding his officers to get the lifeboats ready and everything. Like, Captain Smith, literally after the iceberg collision, he ordered his officers to get the lifeboats ready even before he knew the ship was doomed. While the ship was being inspected for damage, so from about 11:40 to 12:25, the ship was being inspected to see, like, what damage it had taken, and by 12:25 it was confirmed that the ship was mortally wounded and it was going to sink. But before they even found that out, Captain Smith had ordered the lifeboats to be loaded up with food, get them all prepped and ready to go, and just in case. That shows you how precautious he was in real life. But in the film, it just shows him throughout the entire sinking of being in this huge state of shock, not being necessarily a good leader. But in real life, he was giving orders every step of the way, telling each officer what he needed them to do. Going to the wireless operator room, immediately telling them to start sending out distress calls. Like, the movie didn't do a good job of depicting Smith throughout the sinking. And the other thing the film does wrong, and this, I don't know if the fate of Captain Smith has been speculated all throughout the 20th century. Like, how did he die? And in every Titanic film, the cliche is always the same. Smith goes down with the ship. He locks himself in the bridge and goes down with the ship. It's like some kind of like seaman rule where it's like the last person to leave a ship is the captain. And he goes down with the ship in every depiction of the sinking. But in real life, that's not what happened. If you have read the book On a Sea of Glass, many eyewitnesses confirmed that they saw Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews jumping overboard during the final plunge. That's what happened to them in real life. Now, their bodies were never recovered. But in real life, Captain Smith did not go down with the ship. But like I said, Captain Smith was a highly decorated, captain. He was a White Star Line veteran. He was given the nickname the $1 Million Captain because of how well respected he was. He was a good man. He was a good he earned that captain spot for a reason. And did the best he could that night to save lives, and the film just, in my opinion, doesn't do a good job of showing that. I think they could have did a better job. Now, a person that was actually depicted correctly, this is the only person I feel in the film that was done correctly, was Molly Brown. Throughout the entire sinking, they show her to be not like your average, millionaire. She was a great woman, great sense of humor, and a very genuine good person too. Like we all know the scene of, Jack's given an invitation by Rose to go with her to one of the first class parties, and Molly Brown lets Jack borrow her son's tuxedo, and ironically it fits Jack perfectly. But anyway, that's how, from what I've read, that's how Molly was in real life. And again, I love how accurately they portrayed her taking charge of the lifeboat that she was put in, and she was the one who kept trying to convince the crew members in that boat to go back and look for survivors. Unfortunately, she couldn't, convince them to do so, but she fought to the nail to try to convince them to go back and get more survivors, which also aided in her getting the nickname the Unsinkable Molly Brown. She even started a fundraiser, so the rescue vessel that rescued all the passengers after the Titanic sinking was the Carpathia, and Molly Brown started a fundraiser where she raised all this money and gave a certain amount to each crew member in thanking them for rescuing them, and each crew member also got awards, for their service of rescuing the Titanic survivors. And Molly Brown played a role in that whole thing starting out in the first place. So that shows you what a good person Molly Brown was. So I'm very happy that the film did a great job of portraying her correctly. Now, this next person I'm going to talk about is a man that has been wrongfully placed in history as this, villain who only cares about money and attention, and it's just not true. And the person I'm talking about is Bruce Ismay, who is a chairman of the White Star Line shipping company, who helped with the designing and stuff, I believe, of the RMS Titanic. And in every depiction of the Titanic disaster, Bruce Ismay is always shown to be the villain of the story, where it was through his actions that led to Titanic being sped up and sent straight into the ice field that led to her demise. And the reason for this is that Bruce Ismay had a meeting with Captain Smith a few days into the voyage, and they were discussing the ship's speed. And they were talking about this in one of the first-class restaurants. And there was a lady sitting at a table very near. Her name escapes me, but she heard the entire conversation. And she brought this up during the British inquiry. And Bruce Ismay, in every depiction of the Titanic, disaster, that whole sequence at that restaurant shows him pressuring Smith into lighting up the rest of the boilers to have the ship go at the fast speed she was already going at, which was 21 knots, and have it be pushed up to 23 or something. And the ship was going a lot faster by this point than what she was supposed to. There's this brilliant section on a Sea of Glass that talks about they were pushing her to the limits a little bit. The ship was only supposed to be going 21 knots. They ended up getting her up to 23. So there was a chance that the ship was actually going to arrive a day early in New York City. The goal was to arrive by the 18th on Wednesday, but it looked like there was a chance that the ship was going to arrive Tuesday night on April 17th. I believe is how it is. And it seems that in every depiction of Bruce Ismay, has them pressuring Smith into lighting up the rest of the boilers, have the ship go faster so that they can break Olympics time and make another record, And in real life, that's not what Bruce Ismay did at all. Bruce Ismay was a good man. He was, in real life, when him and Captain Smith were at that restaurant, he was just simply making a observation. As, like, hey, we're making good time on the ship. There's maybe even a good chance that we'll make it Tuesday night. But it was just a observation. He was not, pressuring Smith to do that. Like, Bruce Ismay did not have that kind of authority. He was just, a passenger. And he was sent on board because he was, and he, along with Thomas Andrews, were put in charge of inspecting the ship to see how she does on her first voyage, to see if there was anything that needed, updating or prepared. Because, with anything that you build, you have to test it out first to see how it works, to see if it needs, any tweaking, if you will. So Bruce Ismay was one of those individuals who was in charge of going on the ship's first voyage to see how well she does, how she operates. And Bruce did not have the authority to pressure Smith into having the ship go faster. That wasn't up to him. Captain Smith always had the final say on what he wanted to do. And Bruce Ismay survived the sinking by getting in one of the last lifeboats that left. And in the film, they already portray him to be this, this Scrooge McDuck villain who only cares about the money and records and the media attention. But that's not how Bruce was in real life. He was just very proud of his ships and wanted them to be successful, but, he was never keen on having the ships make earlier rivals and breaking records and all that. That's not who Bruce Ismay was. And the other thing that drives me crazy is that, the movie goes so far out of its way to make him a villain, and that's not how he was. There's a deleted scene of him boarding the Carpathia, and he is looking around, and all the survivors up on the deck are all looking at him with this look of just pure disgust. How dare you survive when 15 other people froze to death in the Atlantic waters? But in real life, that's not what happened. Bruce Ismay helped save people, by the way. That was something that was completely cut from the film that, in my opinion, should have been added in. If you've read the book On a Sea of Glass, Bruce Ismay was at multiple lifeboat stations, and he knew that the ship was sinking, and he was convincing passengers who would get in the boats, please get in the boat. He helped save so many women and children that night. He was a hero. And the only reason he survived was because, during the end, when one of the last boats was getting ready to leave, he noticed there was still room in it. And the rule was women and children first. So if you got all the women and children in, and there were no other women and children in the vicinity, as a man, by that point, you were allowed to get in the boat. So he did that. And that's how he survived. And none of the passengers were, from what I understand, none of the passengers were looking at him with this look of disgust. Ismay was never the same after Titanic sank. He even regretted saving himself once he learned how many people perished. He thought that he had helped get a good majority of the women and children off the boat, but that's not the case. Over 1,500 people perished that night, and only 705 survived. And that absolutely destroyed him. Heck, he retired, I think, not long after, a few years after this, he retired, and he disappeared from the public eye altogether. During the 3 days it took for the Carpathia to take the survivors to New York City, Ismay literally locked himself in one of the rooms and didn't speak to anybody for those 3 days. He isolated himself. One of the Titanic officers and Jack Thayer went to visit him, and he was a mess. He was shaking like a leaf. He was not the same man he was just a day prior. He was never the same. He theoretically was a man who died twice. He died for good in the 1930s, I believe it was, but he also died the first time on the night of the sinking because he was never the same afterwards. And as he grew old, the Titanic became a very taboo subject among his family. Like, nobody really talked about it. Apparently, a year before he passed away during Christmas, he was hanging out with his granddaughter, and she asked him, "Have you ever been on a sinking ship?" And he just goes, "Yes, I was once on a ship that was thought to be unsinkable." That was the last time he gave any mention of Titanic. So in real life, Bruce Ismay was a hero who saved many lives, and he did not pressure Captain Smith into the Titanic going faster that led the ship going into the ice field at full speed. It was not his fault the Titanic sank. And today, all throughout pop culture, Bruce Ismay is remembered as this money jumping in a pool of coins villain like Scrooge McDuck. And that's just not true. And he deserves justice. And I'm tired of, all these movies portraying him very inaccurately in this way. It's just not right. And another person I want to bring up here is Thomas Andrews. Now, for the most part, so Thomas Andrews was the chief designer for the Olympic class vessels, and he was also a very good family man. Like, he was the kind of guy, like, if you've read On a Sea of Glass, Thomas Andrews was the kind of guy who loved going down into the dry dock where the ship was being built, and he would just eat lunch with the workers and talk with him. Like, this guy was, like, extremely high on the social status. Like, he had a lot of money, wore the fancy clothing, but he treated everybody equally. He didn't care about how much money or what your social status was. He treated everybody equally. And he was a big family man and a very hard-working man who worked as much as he possibly could to make Titanic and her siblings the safest ships afloat. And I think for the most part, the Cameron film does a good job of portraying Thomas Andrews correctly. Now, the one thing that I don't agree with is how Thomas Andrews was portrayed during the sinking. So he's at the same level to how Captain Smith was portrayed. So in the movie, there was a scene where, Thomas Andrews tells the officers, like, "Why are you only filling these boats up half full? We tested these in England with over 70 people on them. Load these up, man. What are you doing?" Like, that's accurate. That was good. But the scene that I don't like is how Thomas Andrews dies. So again, here is another cliche that's featured in every Titanic film, is that Thomas Andrews walks down into the first class smoking room and just goes down with the ship. And we see this portrayed again in the Cameron film, where he's essentially given up. Like, he feels like he's done all he can to help people. He just goes down into that room and waits for his demise. And that's not what happened in real life. There are first-hand accounts of passengers seeing Thomas Andrews in that room, but he didn't stay there. And the time frame of when he was in that room is really kind of a guess. We don't know an accurate time frame of when he went down into that room. Passengers did see him in there, but we don't know when in the sinking process he was seen in that room. It's up for discussion. So we know that he went to that room, but he did not stay there. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, him and Captain Smith jumped off the ship during the final plunge. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews spent the entire sinking process saving as many lives as humanly possible, all the way to the very end. That is what they did. They didn't just give up, lock themselves in these rooms, and go down with the ship. Like, that is not accurate at all, and I think that does them injustice. These men were extremely brave, and they helped save hundreds of lives that night, and they deserve to be accurately portrayed. And I think this cliche of them just giving up and going down with the ship needs to stop. In real life, they saved so many people, and both of them died heroes as far as I'm concerned. And here is another big one that's very controversial that even James Cameron himself admitted later on that he regrets portraying this character, this real-life person, the way he did, and that is First Officer Murdoch. Now, First Officer William Murdoch, he was portrayed pretty well for the first half of the movie. But during the second half, during the iceberg collision, when he's in charge of First Officer Lightoller and First Officer Murdoch, they were the two put in charge of loading the lifeboats. Lightoller was in charge of loading the boats on the left-hand side of the ship, and Murdoch was in charge of loading the lifeboats on the right-hand side. And throughout the sequence in the film of Murdoch helping load the boats, he takes a couple of bribes from Rose's fiance, Cal, but then towards the end of the movie, Murdoch takes the money and throws it in Cal's face and says, "Your money can't save you any more than it can save me," or something like that. But, there was a good portion where Murdoch was taking bribes from Cal, showing Murdoch to be this guy who can easily be bribed, and that was just outright wrong. And then we have, scenes of him, getting distracted from his duties and not taking them very seriously, which was another very big inaccuracy. And then the thing that really gets me is his demise. We see scenes of him shooting men who are trying to jump the boats, outright killing male passengers. I think he ended up killing 2 or 3 men, and that's not what happened in real life. There are eyewitness accounts that, yes, a lot of the officers were handed out pistols, but they never... there was a quick little meeting where I believe the officers were handed revolvers, and they never shot at passengers or shot passengers. They just fired them in the air to maintain order, to stop people from jumping the boats. They were trying to make sure that a panic did not start out, because you gotta keep in mind, when the full extent of the damage was found, Thomas Andrews calculated that Titanic had 1 or 2 hours to live before she disappears. So these officers have less than 2 hours to save as many lives as possible with the 20 boats that are on board. And each lifeboat took around 10 to 15 minutes to launch. Now times that by 20. They didn't have time. So they were trying their very best to maintain order and get these boats loaded as quickly as possible. So they had to fire warning shots "Don't jump these boats. We're trying to maintain order." But from all accounts, none of the officers shot anybody. And First Officer William Murdoch did not commit suicide. In the James Cameron film, he shoots himself in the head after he regrets shooting one of the male passengers. But we don't know if any of this is true. His descendants, when they saw the film, they were not happy with Cameron at all with how First Officer Murdoch was portrayed in the film. And James Cameron issued an apology to the family, and he has since stated that he regrets, portraying Murdoch the way he did. This was a real-life man whose reputation's probably now ruined because of films like the 1997 Titanic film, because a good amount of people are going to watch this now and think that that's factual. Because a lot of people get their information from media. Hollywood films have a very, very, very bad history of when they base films on real-life events, they really play around with history. And this was very big during, the late 90s with films like The Patriot or Braveheart. These films played with history a lot, and they were not historically accurate at all. But in Cameron's case, he got the film historically correct on a lot of things, but when it came to the real-life humans, he did a lot of them injustice and just outright did not depict them correctly. So Murdoch perished that night, but we don't know how he died. He most likely froze to death in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, but he did not shoot himself in the head. That did not happen. First Officer William Murdoch died a hero who helped save over 705 people, and that's how he should be remembered. Not taking bribes from Cal and shooting passengers. Like, that's not First Officer William Murdoch. That is not an accurate portrayal. And one last little thing that I didn't agree with was how Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were depicted. So we see them for only a couple of scenes in the film when they're in the crow's nest looking out in the horizon. Like, we have, like, when we get to the scene of when they spot the iceberg, like, right before this, both of them are depicted as being distracted. Like, you can see them looking down from their crow's nest, watching Jack and Rose make out on the boat deck. And, they're like, would you look at that? I bet they're warmer than we are. Then they look back up at the horizon, and then boom, what do they see? The iceberg right in Titanic's path. So the film is making it look like that they were partly responsible for the iceberg collision because they weren't doing their job of looking at the horizon. But in real life, that's not what happened. There was nobody, canoodling on deck for them to be distracted. Both these men took their jobs very seriously. Their eyes were on that horizon the entire time. Another thing you need to keep into account, the reason why they didn't spot the berg up until it was too late was because it was pitch black that night. And the water, there was no waves, nothing. The wall was crystal clear. Like, there was no moon. It was quiet, man. You could hear a pin drop. And the ice field was camouflaged by this dark horizon because there was no light source from the moon. There was no moon that night. And, the passengers said the sea that night was like glass, hinting the title of that book I keep mentioning, On a Sea of Glass. And Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were not distracted in any kind of way. They spotted the berg as best they could. They called the bridge. They told them iceberg straight ahead. Then the officers did their job of trying to avoid the berg. But Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, did the best they could. And they did their jobs. And they were nowhere at fault for the iceberg collision. And I hate that the film tries to depict them that way. That was just not accurate. And both these men deserve to be remembered in them doing their job to their very best and helping in almost avoiding the collision. And what's really sad about these two men is that both of them had very sad endings. Like, Frederick Fleet, I think, lived with guilt with the Titanic disaster that he never got over. He actually ended up committing suicide a couple of decades later after the Titanic sank. And I believe Reginald Lee died during World War I. So both of them had very sad endings. And they were both good men who did their job the best they could. And that's how they should be remembered. So, and that wraps it up. That is all the notes that I have about the James Cameron 1997 Titanic film. Now, I love this movie to death. And if you guys want to go check out my recording of me covering the film, I'd highly recommend you go do so. I had a lot of fun talking about it. I love this movie to death. I really do. I mean, I did hate it a lot as a teenager. I kind of felt like this film was falling into the category of it's extremely overhyped, And once I entered my 20s, I was really starting to realize, okay, this is actually a very good, well-made blockbuster film that rightfully earned the term blockbuster. It is a fantastic film. And it got a lot of things right when compared to the real Titanic history. I just wish that Cameron, when it came to the real-life human beings, I wish that he had portrayed them more correctly, because again, these were real-life people. These aren't some characters that you wrote down for this movie. These were real people. But besides that, when it came to like the sinking and stuff like that, like he got things extremely accurate. Like the rooms that they filmed in, the sets were historically accurate by all accounts, And the fact they built a 90% model recreation of the ship and dropping it in the water for the sinking sequences is outright insane. That they were going to that length of getting this film to the real event as closely as possible. So James Cameron and his team worked their butts off to get this as accurate as possible, and they did a great job overall. This is a great film. If you have not seen the Titanic film, I highly recommend you go watch it. It's a great movie. It teaches you a lot of important life lessons as well. So that is going to wrap up for me covering the historical accuracy of the James Cameron 1997 hit film Titanic. I hope that you enjoyed this recording, and I hope you learned some very cool history about the RMS Titanic. Now, Titanic is my favorite subject to talk about. It's what I'm pretty well known for when it comes to my friends and family. Like, I talk about Titanic history all the time, and I will be doing so for the rest of my life. I think that Titanic was the most beautiful ship ever built, and even the wreck today, I still think the ship is beautiful 112 years later. And I'm hoping this school year I get the opportunity to present my slideshow to the kids again, because I feel like it is my duty to pass along all my Titanic knowledge along to the next generation of people. I think it's very important, and I will talk about Titanic for the rest of my life. So you guys have a excellent rest of your day, and I just want to personally thank you for the bottom of my heart. I want to thank you for listening to this episode and for supporting my show. I love doing this, and getting to host my own podcast, it's really a dream come true. So from the bottom of my heart, I personally thank you for supporting my podcast, Tales of Music and Film. So until next time, my name is Christian Taylor, and you are listening to the Tales of Music and Film.